Okay, where's my pen? Here it is. Right, there's two tips today. I'm going to do, and they're aimed at people who are still maybe struggling, like the task that I gave you, right? Do a simple value study of a landscape. So you're not having to come up with an idea yourself, you're just doing a study of it, and you're doing fairly typical tasks that would be required to do, certainly in an exterior environment. So you'd have to think about aerial perspective and your control of your values. And I know that some people still struggle with this, and it's my sincere hope that by the end of semester 1, and as we go into semester 2, that hopefully most of you are okay with it. But the first tip is maybe a safe kid gloves version of trying this kind of stuff out, where you're going to paint directly on the photo. It's less of a tip, it's more of me encouraging you to do something. So yeah, find a photo that's fairly blank. Now, what I'm going to tell you to sort of do here is similar to stuff actually that people like, I don't know if you know him, there's a guy called Dylan Cole. He's actually, now that this is environment art, and Dylan Cole is a matte painter, but this is an exercise that he would often do, colour sketches. He'd take the most barest bones, empty kind of landscape photo, and then he would very simply just begin to add to it as like a test of his imagination of what to add, but also just as an exercise in studying the photo, picking the colours from it, and beginning to understand what values you need in the background and what values you need in the foreground. So I'll just show you roughly how you might go about doing this. I'm going to use those brushes that the Shadi Safadi brushes that I passed on to you all, and you can use pretty much any one, but I quite like this sample brush 10.3 to sort of do this kind of work. Again, remember, you want to start big, do it on a new layer, and just start picking colours straight from the background plate, as we would call it if we were in VFX. And just begin adding stuff and be loose to it, okay? So think about adding cool, massive, huge stuff on a separate layer so that later on you can go to the eraser. You can then begin to sort of sculpt off what's happening here. I think this, if you're still getting to grips with just how to do landscapes, how to actually, because this isn't obviously sketching, this is laying down the equivalent of paint, of value. If you start practicing this way, you might begin to just develop a feel for it a little bit better. And you can be kind of safe knowing that your colours are going to be all right. Add stuff like this. You could, if you could unhide this, and then you can see what colour the, you can see what colour the highlight side of these kind of mountains are, or these rocky formations. So you can begin to sort of add them to what you've already sketched. But I recommend just trying this. If you're still struggling with just coming up with these landscapes and controlling your values and your ranges, take a blank existing kind of photo and just literally paint on top of it, add to it, and look to see what the values are looking like here. You know, see how they're different, this part to this part. These are lighter because these are a little bit further away. Also remember that you should mess around with something like the Freehand Lasso tool and look at the features that are already in here and help that. You know, it's like coming up with stuff but not 100% coming up with stuff, so it kind of helps you a little bit, takes some of the stress. So I'm going to add something like that. And then I'm going to chop bits off of it because I think that bit could do like this. And then we could hide that. And again, you can just pick a colour, maybe darken it a bit, and instantly kind of add holes in the ground, etc. Let's just darken this bit like this. And this is like, what, 4 or 5 minutes. Play with this, you know, spend maybe a quarter of an hour doing this kind of thing, seeing what you can add to a photo that makes it look like there's something interesting happening, but also using it as an exercise in figuring out what the values are doing, right? So what I quite like doing actually is you could always just add cursor. Go away. There we go. Add Star Destroyers to your scene, because everyone likes Star Destroyers and they always look good when they're floating above some kind of ginormous, what do they call it? Did they call it Jeddah in Rogue One, didn't they? Yeah, so you could do your own kind of Jeddah kind of stuff like that. But this is just like, it's like a safe way of learning some of these value theories of what's happening in a landscape without you having to necessarily come up with it by yourself. So I recommend having a go at this kind of thing. Okay, so that's like that's more of the beginner, not beginner, I don't want to say you're beginners, you're into your second year of the course, so you shouldn't be beginners anymore. But this is more confidence builder, I would call this. Right, what's the other trick, or tip, I should say? Okay, so let's assume that you've been working on an environment and you've been spending hours and hours and hours on it, and it's getting to a point where you're going, oh yeah, I'm okay with that now, I quite like it. But it's empty, it's completely sterile, there's no one in there, and I've already spent like 6 hours working on it, or longer, and now I want to put characters in there. I've got to start doing characters from scratch. What I recommend you start doing right away is start creating your own character sheets. These are kind of going to be, they're almost like clip art, they're almost like stock photography, except that they're painted and you've painted them yourself. And what I would further recommend you do is you begin thinking about theming your character sheets. So I'm building one that's kind of Middle Eastern, because I'm doing lots of, I'm dead into my Egyptian stuff at the moment. So I'm building a sort of Middle Eastern style bunch of people that I can then, whenever I want to, just use them to populate an environment that I'm already working on. This is particularly good. I mean, imagine people often do their environment work and they'll stick one lone knight or horseback rider or whatever like that in their scene in the foreground. But wouldn't it be really nice if you got more ambitious and you did, like, I don't know, like a crowded market scene or something like that? If you just gradually, as your concept, life and career go on, are just adding and building to this kind of character sheet, it means when you get to this point and you want to start adding the characters, it's no longer a kind of daunting, exhausting kind of task to do. Instead, you can just have a look at your character sheet and go, okay, who's going to fit in here? I quite like this guy here with the parasol. So what I might do is I'll find out which layer he is. He's that one, yeah. I'll select him and copy him and paste him into here. And look, he's really rough. This is another thing. You don't need to spend ages, because these aren't meant to be designed as hero characters. These are just people to fill out your kind of scene. I'm going to flip him, make it look like he's heading this way. Make him quite small. Maybe like something like that, maybe. Here's a quick thing. I think I might have covered this when I did the talk on the city thing, but if not, if you haven't heard this, I'll do it again. When you're adding photos or any elements from your painting that come from outside of your painting, which aren't you directly figuring out colors, values, and painting, so photos, existing kind of clip art elements that you've made, have a think about putting the hue saturation adjustment layer at the top of your stack and setting it to absolutely nothing like that. So it's got no saturation, it's black and white. So it becomes a sort of one click on and off, see my entire painting in black and white. Because then you can do this two-stage color correction type thing. At the moment, I want to, and you can do it in two, yes, you want to do it in two stages, sorry. The first stage you want to do is you want to make sure the levels are okay. So this is what the hue saturation adjustment layer is for, because that will switch off, make everything black and white, so when you're looking at it, you're only looking at the layers, the levels. So I bring up Control L for the levels, and now I can look at my little bloke here with his parasol and look at the background and tweak the levels to make it feel like he's fitting in, like that he's not particularly standing out. Like the darkest darks, say, on his feet and on his hands are no darker than what's going on up here, because that just wouldn't be very realistic. So I might lift up his levels a bit like that, mess around with the gamma, the midpoint, until it feels about right, about neutral. So you can do that, and then you can undo the hue saturation, knowing that your levels are roughly right and you're not getting confused by color. And then the next thing you can do is jump into the color balance of that layer, Control B, and just tweak. And you don't have to really worry about shadows and highlights here, because if you've done this first part right and your image, your element coming in is relatively neutral, then you should be able to get away with just fiddling around with the midtones to kind of pull him into the kind of color space of his background. So he's beginning to look like he color-wise fits in there now. Now you need a shadow for him. So what you could do is you could make a selection of him, and you could transform that selection by flipping it vertically, moving that selection down. Oops, I'm moving the whole chap here. Hang on, I'm going to go like, select him. Transform selection, not free transform, that's what I wanted. So now I'm going to flip it vertically, move the selection down like this, and then sort of hold Control down to figure out where my shadow for him should go. I'm actually using quite a small image here, so it's a bit tricky to... Don't want to make the shadow too long, so I might go something like that. Put a layer underneath him for now. Select what I think is like a fairly decent kind of shadow color, and kind of put that in like this. And it got a bloke, and I got a figure in there in just a couple of minutes. Now, what you can further do is you can, well, actually, I'm going to do two things first. And it's actually, this is quite important. If you look at these figures, I've painted them with no strong directional light. You want to do these figures almost as if they were kind of ambient occlusion style rendered, as if they were on an overcast day, because then that's going to give you the most amount of flexibility for actually adding light. So for example, there's clearly a kind of light source coming from this direction, but at the moment he doesn't really feel like he's got that light source. But because I painted him in a neutral kind of way, I can duplicate him. I can change the levels on him so he's just a lot brighter. Okay, this is doing it on the shadow layer. Just unhide that. So let's get him brighter in general. And now if I apply a layer mask, remember a layer mask will allow bits of what's in this layer to show through and not show through. Where it's black, you won't see anything, and where it's white, you will see something of this layer. So if I fill this with black, that temporarily disappears. But now if I paint into that layer mask, I can paint light back onto this clip art kind of figure. So I'll do that very roughly here. So you could go like this. And you don't have to worry about keeping in the lines, because you're only really affecting this layer anyway. So you can paint light back into him, like that. And finally, if you like your stuff looking more, if you want to sort of further blend him in, again, I'm working on a super low res image here, so it's not the best one to kind of show you. You could use the mixer brush. I was just talking to Ren about this. Again, if you haven't messed around with the mixer brush, mess around with it because it's pretty awesome. You want to think about the edges on your character. You want to have a nice, if you're going for that painterly look, you want a nice mix of lost edges and crisp edges. So let's put the mixer brush on. I'm going to do it on a new layer. I'm going to put sample all layers, which might make it a bit slow, although it probably won't make it slow for this image because it's so small anyway. Mixer brush is kind of like a super smudge tool. So it's going to help you blend the colors together and smear them. And the more, the more considered and the more time you spend on this, the more you can make it look like your little clip art figure was literally existing. You know, you always intended him or her to be in there. But yeah, do that. Build up a little bunch of characters, theme them if possible, and you've always got the option of sticking in some cool little characters in that won't be complete afterthoughts where you think, now I'm going to put that knight in the foreground. Oh god, but now I've got to design the knight and I haven't got the energy to it, so he's just going to look really, really meh. Whereas if you've been doing it as a little side project all along, where you're not sort of exhausted from doing the landscape, you're just doing this, then it's going to look more interesting. Because I wouldn't have, if I did this little Egyptian thing here, and I wanted to put a figure in, it would not have occurred to me, off the top of my head, to have some Arabic-looking guy with a parasol on. But because in my spare time, when I was trying to build this up, I came across this guy with the parasol. I thought, oh, that's good. I'll put him in. And it's just going to give your work that little bit of vavavoom, a little bit of zhuzh to your work. What I also just want to talk to you very briefly before I get into the sort of the lecture-y part of it, to finish off the tips, is, okay, but what you said about doing it as sort of ambient occlusion, but how do you actually go about, is there some kind of quick, non-painful way of generating these? As you see, actually, if you're getting close, you see how loose they are. They're really rough. They don't need to be super detailed. They just need to be suggestive of that. I'll show you how I sort of do it. So I think of the theme. I go on a big Google hunt or a Flickr hunt to find some useful looking kind of photos. And so I found this one just before break, and I thought, I really like, look at this guy. He's super useful. He's crouched down. I love the traditional Afghan style dress that he's got on. He'll be great to add to this clip art kind of session. So what I do is find a good candidate. I'm going to just crop into him a bit so I don't get distracted by these other two guys. Those other two guys would be pretty good too as well. I do this in a couple of stages. I'm not going to do the whole thing now because even though it doesn't take too long, it still takes a bit too long to just go through the whole thing. So I will create a new layer. I will use that main silhouette profile kind of brush that I tell you about in the Shadi set, that second one down. Now in a new layer, it doesn't really matter what color you use to begin with at all, a bit like when we're doing thumbnails, because in some ways this is just our silhouette that's going to kind of contain him. And the first thing I do then is just build up his profile shape. And I'm going to try and be relatively accurate, but you don't have to be super accurate because again, he's just going to be a clip art kind of chap. So yep, I'll do this. Let's do his head. So I get his rough profile. I've missed his feet. So do something like that. So there's his rough profile ready to go. Then I'll hide that, create another new layer on top. So I've done the profile and now in a different kind of color. Let's go for something quite bright, like a bright cyany kind of blue. With a much smaller brush now, I'm going to trace over the main details. I'm not going to do every single last bit. Really, what this is for is to help me break down the different materials almost that I'll need. like skin, hat, main clothes and stuff. So, whoops. God, this is a tricky Wacom tablet I've got at the moment. So I'm just going to roughly block in yeah, the different parts of him. So got this cool little sort of waistcoat thing. Blocking his hands, and again, I'm not bothering with every finger or anything like that. I just want the rough suggestion. Because again, as you do more painting stuff, you'll probably begin to realize it's how you simplify reality is the true skill in this. How much can you suggest with the minimum amount of actual brush strokes? So I'll do something like this, and I'll also put in just the main kind of wrinkles and creases, just the key ones. So now I've got a profile, and sitting on top of the profile, I've got the rough line work, so I know where the different sort of material parts are going to be. The next thing I do is on top of the profile, but underneath the sketch, create another new layer, and now you begin to just block it and make it a clipping layer as well. So it's only going to affect stuff that you've already done on the profile, so you don't need to worry about going over the lines or anything like that. Now you sort of untick this and you look at it and go, right, let's do the main color. The main color here is the white of his sort of the main part of his kind of tunic or something. I don't know what you would call that. Robes. You don't want that bright side, because again, you're aiming for an ambient occlusion look. So the one thing you don't want to do when you do this is paint in the actual strong lighting direction. You want just sort of like a neutral, whatever the neutral color of this is. Go back onto here, and first of all, you just go like this. Just paint it where you need it to go. And it's on its own layer, so you don't have to worry about being particularly neat or anything like that, because then you can always go into the eraser and just tidy it up a bit where it needs to be. I'll do it just for this robe part, and you can see that it's essentially the same thing for every part of him. Let's get it in here actually. Yeah, it goes just here, doesn't it, as well? So I'm just going to block it in, rough, and then erase away to neaten it up. The next part would be to generate the shadows, or the ambient kind of shadows for this. So what I would do, I don't know whether anyone else sort of does this. I kind of stumbled into this workflow by accident, but because I was doing lots and lots of these characters, or beginning to do lots of the characters, trying to get as quick as possible doing them, is create a new layer, make it a clipping layer, but straight away control-click that kind of local color layer, and then apply that as a layer mask to this shadow kind of layer that you're going to do. This just means that now, again, I can paint the shadows in, or the rough soft shadows, without worrying about going into his head or his hat or this waistcoat part. So I'm going to unhide that. I'm going to look to see what's the rough kind of shadow sort of color. I don't want it to be too dark, because again, this is a sort of an ambient occlusion kind of look that I'm going for. And on this new layer, what I can do actually normally is just trace over some of these crease lines that I made. Like that, and every now and again I can click back to here and remind myself what are the shadows kind of doing in an interesting way here. Some more just here, and then you can do another thing. I'll do another layer on top. Again, make it a clipping layer. Again, control click that sort of local color, apply it as a layer mask, And on this one, you can sort of do rough sort of highlights. But again, you don't want strong highlights because you want, as I reiterate over and over again, you kind of want that sort of ambient occlusion-y kind of look. So I'm going to go to that, click that on, and you can just add in stuff like this. And then the final thing I like to do as a layer on top of all this, spend more time on this, spend a little bit more time on this, is have one more layer on top. Make that clipping layer. Again, make the selection so that you can turn it into a layer mask, so you don't have to worry about going over the top. Then I like to switch just to this brush here. And I like to use this brush as like a soft shadow or a soft highlight, just because at the moment, obviously, I mean, I've been doing this way too quick. I mean, obviously that's extremely rough at the moment. But having this one extra layer where you can put soft highlights and soft shadows can sort of begin to tie some of this more crude texturing together. So you could go just here, just kind of add some stuff like this. And then delete it if necessary. And then you could do the same for highlights. So you could select that, and you could go maybe a little bit brighter, and just sort of suggest some kind of color variation. So you end up with something that looks, I would say, unless you want to make these characters significantly bigger, I don't think you have to go much more detailed than this. Each one of these was done in exactly the same way as I began to work through this. And I reckon it's getting to the point now where if I sit down with no distractions, I can do one of these in 10 minutes, right? So it doesn't really take long at all. And if you theme them, God, you're going to be just absolutely laughing, because as you progressively do different themed kind of environments that I ask you to do, you can start actually having more than one person in your image, and they'll look kind of legitimate. They won't look kind of plucked out of your own imagination. They'll have a sort of sense of authenticity to them. So yeah, that's the two tips. The one tip is just paint it over a photo. Try and do that as a practice exercise, as a sort of baby steps, feel safe kind of exercise in terms of understanding what's going on in terms of value and color in a landscape. And it can just be fun to just add to it. Put star destroyers over everything, because that always looks good. And then the other tip, yeah, these characters. Consider to start building up this character sheet so that you can add them to your existing artwork and make them look a little bit less airless. Give it a sense of story. Okay, right. So they're the two, they're Friday's tips. And I'll just stop there.